Thank you.
7.5 minutes on.
Thank you very much, Las Corla. In many ways, the Constitution of 1937 has served our country very well and has stood the test of time. If you look at the context within which that Constitution was forged, if you look at the challenges that our young country faced at that time, we had a Europe that was about to go to war. We saw unspeakable and the terrible loss of life across an entire continent. We saw a young country in our own that was emerging from a very divisive, a very bitter civil war. And in the context of all of those challenges, a constitution was put together that allowed our own nation to steer its way, to further steer its way to statehood and to respond to many of those challenges and to keep our country stable, intact, and allow it to take the first steps towards the kind of country which, despite all of its difficulties, we still enjoy now and we're still proud of. So while some of the values and spirit of that constitution have served us well, the question that we have to ask ourselves in the context of this referendum is whether the institutions and whether all the values of that constitution are still relevant for Ireland in 2013. And I think there's two basic tenets of that constitution that we should debate, and I believe we should remove from our constitution. The first one is I would challenge very much the whole concept of vocationalism, the whole concept that there is a requirement for particular sectors and dimensions of our society to be represented at all times within our democratic institutions. And my own view is we have institutions that are fully democratic and that it is up to the people to decide who they want to elect within them. And I do believe that the concept of vocationalism, which at that time was beginning to emerge out of other states at that time across Europe, is no longer a concept that is relevant to a modern country and to a modern democracy where people have the right to choose who they wish to be elected and who they wish to serve them. And coming out of that questioning of that spirit, we then get to the role of the institution of the Seanad, which of course is what this bill and what this debate is all about. And my simple argument in relation to the Seanad would be that an institution that's largely elected by other politicians and by people who went to other or to certain universities is just an institution that does not have a place in modern Ireland. As with Deputy Toomey, I was very privileged to serve in the Seanad, and I do count it as a privilege. But that privilege does not blind me to the fact that it is an institution whose way of election and whose role is no longer fit for purpose in an Ireland that has undergone such radical and such difficult change. And for those who would say, well, what we should do is reform the Seanad and change it, the question they have to answer is, despite how many people have rallied to that cause over the last 70 to 80 years, why has that reform never occurred? And the reason that reform has never occurred is, firstly, there's no consensus regarding what reform should look like. And secondly, if consensus does briefly settle regarding how it should be reformed, inevitably it runs into obstacles itself. Once a vision of reform is settled, there are people who lose within that. And those forces and those groups inevitably resist a reform agenda once it's agreed. And the reason why I want to see this referendum take place, and the reason why I will be voting for the abolition of the Seanad and campaigning for it during this campaign, is I do not see what powers a second house in our system can perform that a single house cannot perform. A single house that's directly elected by the people, and a single house that has greater powers. And the question we need to ask ourselves in the course of that campaign then is, are the additional powers that will be delivered upon the Dáil, will they be adequate for the Dáil to perform the functions that it will need to perform in the absence of the Seanad? And if you look at the measures that are being proposed in relation to a longer legislative process, a greater role for committees, the option for legislation to be reviewed 12 months after it's enacted, the ability for committees to be allocated based on the composition of the Dáil as opposed to just the composition of the government. These are all changes that should allow this chamber to perform that role. But of course there is a difference between should allow and will allow. And this goes to a point that Deputy Toomey made a moment ago, which is there has been long acknowledgement regarding the importance of greater scrutiny of European Union legislation within the Dáil and within the Seanad. But of course that scrutiny has rarely happened. And one of the reasons why that has rarely happened is because the limitations that Oireachtas members face in investing the time to do that kind of scrutiny well, and for it to ensure that it's performed well on behalf of the Dáil. And the challenge that the Dáil will face, and the Seanad faces at the moment, is whether members of either house will commit the energy, the time and the resource that is necessary in order for them to perform that legislative function well.
1 minute remaining.
It's my own belief that in the context of a single chamber, more people will be willing to do that. In the context of greater power being available to the Dáil, more people will invest the time in ensuring that that part of their role is properly performed. As I said a moment ago, for those people that are proposing a bicameral system for Ireland in the future, I would respectfully ask them, what power can a second house perform that this house cannot perform? For people who look for diversity within our political system, surely the people who are best placed to decide how much diversity they want are the people of Ireland themselves, who cast their vote for a single chamber.
Well,
thank you,
Thank you.